to give you an idea of how systemic inequality works and how ideology in particular works to disguise inequality. Let me just show how it affects our world and working people in particular, and women workers even more particularly. This is a well-known chart that showing the difference between productivity gains and worker compensation since the end of the Second World War. There's been a steady increase in productivity over that time, having to do with technology, and also I think worker education. But at a certain point in the early 70s, compensation started remaining flat while productivity continued to increase at the same rate, but all of that increased profit just goes to the corporate shareholders rather than being reflected in a corresponding increase in worker wages. So that's a way in which, I mean, that's unfair in terms of money, but what I want you to think about is the way in which it devalues people's actual time, their actual work, their actual bodies. This split here represents something dehumanizing, because work now, more and more, the productivity of work is attributed to the machine, to the technology. It's owned by the corporation, and the workers become increasingly mechanical maintenance workers, for just resource workers, like any other raw material that keeps the machines running. It's unfair in terms of money compensation, but there's maybe even a more troubling loss of social respect, social recognition for your time, for your labor, and social dignity, for your body, for your identity. So this applies to all workers, men and women. People have calculated how much work, domestic labor, goes uncompensated for women, and it dwarfs totally the not just the loss in wage labor that I just described, but even the corporate profit. So this is the work done at home and caretaking. All the money made by the 50 biggest companies in the world in 2018 is less than the 10.9 trillion that women didn't earn at that time. That's a massive lack of money, but again, I think it's even a more massive deprivation of social recognition, dignity and respect for your labor time, for the work you do with your body, social recognition of your body. Valuing women's bodies is also correlated with assault, violence, which is also radically under-acknowledged, under-prosecuted. That's to say, our normal sense of ourselves, our normal sense of who has credibility or not, disguises tremendous, just massively warped inequality and violence. Self-renunciation, self-denial maybe even self-punishment, are Dorothy's prime means of self-expression, perhaps not because of, it overwrought, religious fervor, but because those are the only means of self-expression open to her. I mean, I think that's still a familiar predicament for women. It's self-harm, something people resort to. No other modes of expression seem available. Even her pleasures, she needs to frame in terms of self-renunciation. Horseback riding, for instance, was an indulgence she allowed herself in spite of conscientious qualms. She felt that she enjoyed it in a pagan, sensuous way and always looked forward to renouncing it. It's very emblematic of Dorothea, who actually has a powerful sort of aesthetic, sensuous, passionate side, a taste for sensuous pleasure, but without means of expressing it or even recognizing it in herself. She wants to disconnect herself from it, disown it as pagan. So Eliot says, on the one hand, she was enamored of intensity and greatness and rash and embracing whatever seemed to her to have those aspects. Yet, which, doesn't necessarily sound negative, but then listen how she concludes the sentence. Likely to seek martyrdom, to make retractions, than to incur martyrdom after all in a quarter where she had not sought it. So this sounds like not intensity of greatness, but intensity of self-mortification. Like she's martyred, again, this kind of ironic redoubling, like Eliot was saying about Saint Teresa, that she, lacked opportunities, but then also lacked commemoration, recognition. Here it's like she's likely to seek martyrdom, but even in seeking, she can't even properly get martyrdom. In her attempt to sacrifice herself, she won't even have that mean opportunity. Self-denial will be denied her. So this is very characteristic of a very characteristic aspect of Dorothea's character in her mind. A clinging to freedom, to be sure, but without any means to express it other than her own self-mortification. Although Dorothea is described as having great marriage prospects, her own prospect on marriage is, Eliot says, very childlike. With all her eagerness to know the truths of life, she retained very childlike ideas about marriage. Even says the really delightful marriage must be that where your husband was a sort of father and could teach you even Hebrew if you wished it. So a father, teacher. And that's what she ends up getting, of course, in Casaubon. But I think it's interesting to think about her kind of arrested development. I mean, we can think of it just as stunted or, naive. I mean, that's how the narrator is kind of characterizing it here. But I wonder again if clinging to this childlike identity is a way of, again, holding on to a sense of freedom, that becoming like sexualized is to become kind of commodified, and she recognizes that, and so this clinging to the intensity of self-mortification is a way of clinging to what little freedom she has. Another example of the passionate, sensuous, like maybe proto-sexual side to Dorothea that she's in self-denial about, and a kind of ambivalence and confusion seems to surround it. Like it was said about the horses that, she took this pagan pleasure from it and looked forward to renouncing it. So she has a kind of confused, conflicted attitude that kind of comes across here too in this opening dialogue with Celia about wearing their late mother's jewelry. Dorothea had initially, wants to have nothing to do with it, and is kind of offended at the very suggestion. But she's spontaneously seduced. Eliot underscores this spontaneity, this immediacy of kind of sensuous reaction, the repetition of the word gleam here. Celia was opening some ring boxes which disclosed a fine emerald with diamonds, and just then the sun passing beyond a cloud sent a bright gleam over the table. "How very beautiful these gems are," said Dorothea, and her new current of feeling as sudden as the gleam. It's a simple and believable kind of mystical moment there that Eliot stages, the sudden eruption of the sunlight and illuminating the gems in Dorothea's eyes, and it's as if it's illuminating her, like she's responding as sudden as the gleam, she's gleaming. So this is an inarticulate, unself-aware side to Dorothea that's getting very powerfully underscored here, I think. Also, rather poetically in terms of synesthesia, this kind of blurring of the senses, suggesting a kind of sublime passion. It's strange how deeply the colors seem to penetrate one, like scent. So the light is like scent. And later, when she's trying to decide whether to keep them, she thinks fondly of just having them by her to feed her eye on these little fountains of pure color. So she's getting a color that has a scent and on which she can feed as if it were food. It's an intensely vital kind of pleasure that she reacts to, compulsively, like almost, like a kind of addiction, just a super intense passion. In fact, the reference to being penetrated by the scent of the color recalls Saint Teresa's erotic experience of being penetrated by the angel, and adds to this synesthetic blur, of seeing, smelling, tasting, and even bodily penetration. So this scene ends with Dorothea being kind of mean to Celia, again kind of disowning the pleasure that she's taking. When Celia asks her, she'll wear them in company. Dorothy kind of haughtily replies, "I cannot tell to what level I may sink." So she's very conflicted about her own pleasure, and it has a social identity or identity with her sister that's based around kind of deflecting that confusion into hostility towards Celia, And it's a really immature. So I think this childlike behavior by Dorothea it shines another light on her social progress project with the cottages. Begins to seem kind of childish, like she's playing house or something in this context. But notice how the little spat between the sisters is resolved. As Celia bent over the paper, Dorothea put her cheek against her sister's arm caressingly. Celia understood the action. Dorothea saw that she had been in the wrong, and Celia pardoned her. Since they could remember, there had always been a mixture of criticism and awe in the attitude of Celia's mind towards her elder sister. The younger had always worn a yoke, but is there any yoked creature without its private opinions? That's interesting. I think Celia comes out seeming a little more mature here. Dorothea performs the action, but she can't articulate an apology. It seems very childlike. But Celia understood the action. It sounds like Dorothea doesn't, at least not enough to recognize it explicitly in language. Celia seems to be more aware of relationships. She's certainly more aware of Chetham's interest in Dorothea, romantic interest in Dorothea. She's more aware what a disastrous choice it is to marry Casaubon. And after all, this is what the narrator says about Celia right at the beginning of the chapter, that she's more worldly, has more common sense, and that practical wisdom is decisive often in this novel. You know, they're romantic characters like Dorothea, Lydgate, and Ladislaw to some degree. But they have to suffer in order to reconcile their ideals, their dreams with reality. They have to learn common sense sooner or later. So common sense is necessary, enforced by reality. But common sense is not sufficient by itself. In the experiments of time that Eliot describes in the process of social evolution, common sense just means reproducing the same. And as we've been tracing, the same is a pretty confining, if not enslaving, world for women. It's a deadly world, you know. That's the historical context of debates over slavery, the often desperate condition of working people and peasants. So common sense in the Romantic period is like the narrator of We Are Seven. That common sense, which leaves people uncounted. It's also the common sense Wordsworth laments, curses in The World Is Too Much With Us, the common sense of possessive consumerist individualism just turns the world into a product for consumption. We isolate ourselves from the world, drain it of meaning. If you recall this apple picture, it's as if it turns life itself into an ad. You're taught to aspire to this consumerist dream, and then even when you're not consuming, that's all you can want. You become out of tune to nature. Much of William Blake's work is about showing the deadly costs of common sense, the way in which our common sense, you know, what the difference between life and death human and animal, what it means to show pity and mercy, and our idea of social power. Like Victor Frankenstein, the speaker in the tiger is imagining the creative force behind nature, behind the tiger. But it's an imagination that, like Victor Frankenstein's, is kind of distorted by industrial technology and can only imagine a kind of tyrannical, coercive, fearsome creator, which ends up turning nature into a reflection of industrial machinery, so that we don't even recognize it anymore. And common sense involves, the kind of racism that Blake describes in The Little Black Boy. A song ostensibly about liberation from racism, which nonetheless implicitly reproduces, reaffirms racism, insofar as the point of getting liberated from racism would be finally for the little white boy to reciprocate the little black boy's love. So racism is written into even the dream of release from racism. Again, that's the way ideology organizes your behavior on a deeper level than your conscious thinking recognizes. Kind of ideologically mechanized common sense. In Middlemarch is perhaps most exemplified by Mr. Brooke, the inane chatter, incessant kind of mechanical repetition, represents, I think, the mechanism of Blake's human abstract. Mr. Brooke would go into progressive politics on the side of reform. But for him, pity is just a word that's systemically implicated. Complacency with politics affirms things as they are more than outspoken defense would, because this is ideological defense. Inane chatter, it's a pretty remarkable picture of a hollow man, just someone who chatters, but whose chatter is deadly. Mr. Brooke also sheds important light on Dorothea's choice to marry Casaubon, for this reason. She wants out from under Mr. Brooke, and his inanity only adds to the suffocation, as indicated here. The narrator speaking in sort of in Dorothea's voice. If that learned man would only talk instead of allowing himself to be talked to by Mr. Brooke, who was just then informing him that the Reformation either meant something or it did not, that he himself was a Protestant to the core, but that Catholicism was a fact. And as to refusing an acre of your ground for a Romanist chapel, all men needed the bridle of religion, which, properly speaking, was the dread of a hereafter. I made a great study of theology at one time, said Mr. Brooke, as if to explain the insight just manifested. I know something of all schools. I knew Wilberforce in his best days. Do you know Wilberforce? Well, Wilberforce was perhaps not much of a thinker, but if I went into Parliament, as I've been asked to do, I should sit on the independent bench, as Wilberforce did, and work at philanthropy. So Wilberforce is a famous abolitionist. But for Mr. Brooke, he's a talking point, name-dropping. He's incessantly name-dropping, indifferently name-dropping. anti-slavery, pro-slavery. You get the feeling that for Mr. Brooke, they're just um, different brands, different ways of marketing himself. Sort of a slumlord, and then he's running in favor of reform. So he represents a regressive, oppressive perspective, not because he's defending aristocracy or slavery, but because he's made human rights, progressive politics, a indifferent matter of branding. Again, just a kind of public promotion, commodification.